I look around this room and multitudinous waves of history. One person who interviewed me for my job 93 semesters ago. And in the interim, about a number of my old students. But in any case, before we get started, Father Abbott has to be at a wake in a few minutes. He wrote a few words. I didn't know he was going to be here. I was going to read them. But since he did come, we're going to let him do it. So if you don't mind, Father.
Thanks to Dick and to all of you who are here this evening and for all who contributed to this celebration of Will Stubbs. Wonderful memories. I've been here since 1959. Chuck Manoli was my history professor. He never wants to admit to it, but it's a little longer than 93 semesters, Dick, so you have a while to go to catch up to me. It's 54 years this year, so. Anyhow, I am grateful for this opportunity to be a part of this celebration for Will Stubbs on the occasion of the publication of his 39 poems, Welcome to the Dying Rose Nights. In his New York Times obituary, which is entitled Irish Poet of Sale and Strife, Will Stubbs was, of course, a kindred spirit of Seamus Heaney. Heaney once remarked that he was enraptured by words as bearers of history and mystery. Beyond being enraptured by words, I think Will Stubbs would have said amen to Seamus Heaney's thought about the meaning of poetry. The poet is on the side of undeceiving the world. It means being vigilant in the public realm. But you can go further still and say that poetry tries to help you to be truer, purer, wholer being. Listen to these 3 short pieces. I won't tell you which one belongs to Seamus Heaney and which one belongs to Will Stubbs. His voice on the phone, light slants on the cliches, apt silence. He is there, safely part of my death gleams in the polished oak stairs. I hand his mother the phone. The black doorway skive moves, knows we all go somewhere else. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. Sunlight still on the lake where water birds swim, dive down, burst the surface, shock the air with sprinkles, cries to all that goes on, with veering soars, flaps, glides, forever as our voices, death will steal, unless you bless me. On this blessed occasion, may I bless you, Will Stubbs, and all who have gathered here this evening to honor your memory and the good poems that you have given to us.
I think it's clear that this is not a memorial, but a celebration of Will and of poetry, something that has enriched all our lives over the years. Will and I actually go back. I'll tell you one little story and then turn things over to Peter. But we go back actually 53 years. Jim Sweeney introduced us and we began celebrating at Frankie Gustine's in Oakland, and of course proceeded through the streets of Pittsburgh, got in my 53 Chevy and drove out to Etna to Jim Sweeney's fiancee's place. Closed the night there. I don't remember whether we came back to the dorm or whatever, but the next morning I looked in my car, and in the back seat was a sheet of papers. Back then we used to fold them in half, and the comments would be on front, and then everybody did that. All the TAs did that wherever we taught. And I put them in a box. I never thought I'd see Will again, but just in case. So finished my studies, and then went to Africa for a while. Came back, 67. January of 68, I got hired at St. Vincent. Coming down Wimmer Hall, those of you who remember that long, kind of dark hallway, and I walked past an open office, and there was a guy sitting in there writing. And I looked in there and I said, "You're Will Stubbs." He was in a laconic mood. And he said something like, "Yeah." And, I said, "I met you at when we were celebrating the World Series with Jim Sweeney." He said, "Yeah, yeah." Mm-hmm. And I said, "You know, you left a stack of papers in the back seat of my Chevy." He said, "Oh, I wondered what happened to those papers." 6 years later, he came to me and he said, "Do you still have those papers I left in your car?" And I said, "No, I had them saved for a while, Will, but then I threw them out." And he said, "Oh, okay, I just wondered. I'm going to Pitt's homecoming, and some of those guys are going to be at the game, and I thought if you had those papers, they might want to get them back."
We like to say, even to this day, that Will was POMO, or postmodern, before postmodernism was cool, and he was. We read people such as R.D. Laing, cutting-edge philosophers like Herbert Marcuse, Marshall McLuhan. Our text was a collection of 3 charts, or shooting scripts, collages of names and images, one of which is now the background for my Twitter page. And it was called Blueprint for a Counter-Education. And that summed up Will as a teacher, a counter-educator who helped us learn on our own the things that society and advertising and the power authorities did not admit or want us to know, especially about Vietnam, but also about race, how to do critical thinking, conformity, and Will also taught us that poetry is counter-educational by reading us poems by Robert Bly, Robert Lowell, and many, many other, and Seamus Heaney as well. He gave his time freely, such as the famous Ulysses sessions we had on Friday afternoons. We'd read a chapter a week with him interpreting, questioning, laughing, and of course that was Ulysses by James Joyce. And one time I asked him, I said, "Well, this is kind of like an English lab. You know, you have bio for 3 credits, and then you have a bio lab, and that's 4 credits. And I said, "Gee, couldn't I get credit, an extra credit?" And he smiled and paused and said, "Yeah, as soon as I get paid for that, too." So that was his funny way of saying, "Hey, I'm doing this on my own. I'm giving free of my time." And that's just one example of him giving his time outside of class. Another is how he was faculty moderator of the literary magazine Generation. I sent in 6 poems, and I put them in quotes because they weren't very good. Out of the 6, only 1 was accepted, and they were romantic, derivative of Wordsworth and perhaps Joyce Kilmer. Even a tough-minded POMO guy like me ended up writing very squishy kind of pieces, big on feelings, but maybe short on images and straight talk. The others were rightly rejected by Will and the student editors. But the one they did accept gave me some hope. I mean, I was really crushed, actually, but I think it was good medicine, really. And the one they accepted, I still remember to this day, and I'll recite it right here. It goes, "When I read another's verse and watery-eyed, lips pressed together, I lean back in my chair and sigh, if only I could create the world out of words, I also know to keep that feeling means I can. Now, it's not a great poem. It was about 20 years old. In a way, I was one of the students who didn't quite get what Will was teaching about poetry. Many others did. James Villano, Bill Shields, Mike Farley were really good poets then. But in that last line, I think Will realized that I was writing about the potential to learn. He knew that the ability to create something beautiful in words begins in an appreciation for what others have done, and that was the seed of my potential as a poet. And it was typical of Will's high standards, yet not totally rejecting all of the poems, finding the one that had some merit, and he was really right about that. A poem once called To a Solitary Disciple by William Carlos Williams. It's a kind of meta poem. It's about a poem about how to write poetry. And I'd like to just put it up on the doc cam here for just a minute so that you can follow along, and I'd like to read it and then talk a little bit about it. To a Solitary Disciple by William Carlos Williams. Rather notice, mon cher, that the moon is tilted above the point of the steeple, than that its color is shell pink. Rather observe that it is early morning, than that the sky is smooth as a turquoise. Rather grasp how the dark converging lines of the steeple meet at a pinnacle. Perceive how its little ornament tries to stop them. See how it fails. See how the converging lines of the hexagonal spire escape upward, receding, dividing. Petals that guard and contain the flower. Observe how motionless the eaten moon lies in the protective lines. It is true in the light colors of the morning, brownstone and slate, shine orange and dark blue, but observe the oppressive weight of the squat edifice. Observe the jasmine lightness of the moon. Now, the great thing about Will as a teacher and a poet is also what was great about him as a man. His kindness towards his students, towards his friends, to all creatures. It's what I call in the introduction a kind of tenderness towards existence that he had. For in his manner, in his voice, in his gaze, in those eyes of his. And this comes together, Will as teacher, poet, and man, in a poem I also mentioned in the introduction called Giving a Lecture on Damien. Damien, of course, by Hermann Hesse, was very popular back then, which he read at a Kennedy Hall talk way back in the early 70s. And I thought I had lost it until years after, even like a year and a half after I wrote the introduction, I found it. It fell out of a college textbook while I was cleaning up. I thought, wow, this is it. And I looked at it, I opened it up, and it seemed sort of magical. And here it is, it's sort of all tattered, and it looks, like it's been folded a million times and read many times. I was amazed and very happy to get it. It's almost like being able to touch something Will touched. Giving a lecture on Damien. Growing quiet, they remind me of a grass path, closing in a field. Each voice stops like a shadow. I'm tempted to tell them how carefully silly it feels, watching them force a silence, terrible as empty notebook pages. But that would glance across their brains like sun warps, sheer in mica edges, which won't be on the test. I'm tempted to wait until they feel the silence with a nervousness showing how they can't stop stopping. The chairs are gentle hands, our pulses find the way through our blood without interrupting. And I begin with the truth of where we are, eyes grown carefully in our heads. I discuss the sense of shells, birth holes, birth flashes, where the body wriggles into wordless horizons, fragile holds woven in body heat, as the nest is woven in light from bottomless grains, always breaking cycles, but never in two. My hands point into the room, thinking mountains. The next sentence, unspoken, rises, turns, veers in my mind like a lucid fish. I want to keep it for newness. I feel it, but I can't remember how it begins. The outlines no help. The earth moves. We see the sanity of the sun. The sentence comes back, and I begin, letting breath into a word. Its noise is pure as a wren bursting from Buddha's stone nose. You can see in that poem his care and love for the students, his gentleness as a person, his respect for the mysterious way the mind works, and his respect for poetry.
I have, of course, many fond memories of him. I'd just like to share a few of those and read one poem that he wrote early in his career. He and I team taught a freshman English course, language and rhetoric. We combined our classes. Peter Blair was one, and Peter reminded me last night that many pre-meds had been blocked into that section, so we had a good class. It was large. We would almost always meet them together, the two of us. Occasionally one of us would take a Friday off or something. And I must admit, it was always a lot more fun when Will was there. He could, if someone was having a hard time, he could figure out what was going on. He could talk with someone in a very non-threatening way and figure out what we needed to do to bring that person around. I did my best when Will was there, but it was a good experience for me to see how he handled a classroom and how he interacted both in class and out of class with students. The poem I would like to read is an early work by Will. In the course of helping Professor Wasolik get this collection together, Peter and I have talked in person or via email about the project, and he has often mentioned this poem, teaching a class on Damien to me, as the fabled missing poem that he knows is in there somewhere in his mother-in-law's basement perhaps, but one of these days he's going to track it down, and he did. He was so happy. Well, I had a poem like that too, one that Will wrote probably in 1967. It had been published in Poetry Northwest, which is a very good, long-standing poetry journal. Will was on a roll between 1965 and 1970 with Poetry Northwest and other journals too, but he would send in 2 or 3 or 4 poems at a time. And one of them was called The Family Drives to Homer City. I don't know if you remember where Homer City is. It's south of Indiana. It's not far north from Blairsville. And the poem is about a trip that, by car that the family did at that time. I was determined to find that poem for tonight. And so last Friday, I went to the University of Hawaii's main campus. Up in the stacks on the 2nd floor, here are all these bound volumes of Poetry Northwest. I had some citations from Google and other places, and I tracked them down. The second volume I opened up, The Family Drives to Homer City, popped out. But I couldn't resist. I just Xeroxed everything I could find from those 5 years when he was publishing there, and came up eventually with about 20 poems, most of them short, some medium length, nothing of great length, but here's my favorite poem by Will from that time. I choose it, I suppose, because it does what Peter was talking about. It gets the things into the poem. The everyday things that we tend not to think very much about, as it turns out, meant a lot to Will. But you should know about this poem that Will himself did not drive an automobile. He did not have a license. So the driver in this trip is his wife, Mary. Will is in the passenger seat. Two of the children, there were eventually three, are in the back seat. Jonathan, the middle child. Jennifer, the oldest of the three children. And young Sarah, I don't think was quite yet arrived in this world at that point, but here they are, going up. The kids would be maybe 5 or 6, at that great age when brother and sister can get along so well in the back seat, and they're a little restless at that point. Things are going by. The radio is on, and as Ron Tranquilla in his introduction to the House of Long Smoke noted, Will loved the radio from the 40s and into the 50s. He loved the comedy shows, he loved the ethnic shows, Fibber McGee and Molly, Amos and Andy Hour, anything on the radio, he just loved. And he kept up, as the years went by, with his students' music, which to my ear got a little strange as the years went by, but I think Will always made it a point to try to understand what his students were listening to in the 70s and the 80s. And, well, the radio's on in this car as it turns out. I think that's about all I want to say about the poem, except to draw your attention to something that happens in the last line with the rear view mirror, which of course gives us a different view of things. But in this case, Will's sitting in the passenger seat, so the rear view mirror is even a little more out of kilter from what we might expect. But here it is. The family drives to Homer City. The view from the car goes phone wires and leaves, a roof in branches, and Jen goes, "I know who lives there." John goes, "How do you know they're there?" An empty school belfry aims a silence. Jen goes, "I was there." A hillside holds in bright stones. John goes, "They could be gone." A vein in my wrist beats like a gate in the wind. Jen bites her fist. It's so good. Wild as falling downstairs, a bug smears the windshield. John makes a fist. I want some too. You go, "Please stop it, please." Your voice is housebroken. The horizon rings in belfry wood grain. Seeds switch light without stopping dream one. A crow calls. A tree says, "Steel for assembly." Jen goes, Crossing a bridge, I see a billboard man and woman wearing out one star at a time. John goes, "She's eating an apple." But the apple's not real, hon. A plane crosses from the bug guts to a handprint. The radio cries, "Not a trace of doubt in my mind." The road trembles empty in the rear view mirror. Will was a very good colleague. He would step in when other people were studying their notes or figuring out their schedule. I remember when we needed someone to teach a business communication course, which was not the favorite. Will said, I'll do it. When 18th century literature course rolled around in the schedule, everybody was, fiddling around. Ron Tranquilla was looking for a volunteer. It was Will who did that.
This was the first time in my life that literature made me feel uncomfortable and ill at ease. And that's what this course accomplished, was to make me really look very closely at the modern tradition in literature and to begin to examine in a very critical way what it was that writers and poets were presenting. We covered four major figures. He began by talking in a literary criticism mode about the lyrical ballads, the preface to the lyrical ballads, urging writers to adopt common speech and common language in their works, poets in particular. Then we went on to Ezra Pound. If there was an ever enigmatic figure in the world of poetry, it was Ezra Pound. From Ezra Pound, we went on to James Joyce, beginning with A Portrait of the Artist, and then ending with the epic novel Ulysses, voted best novel of the century. I'd like to know who voted. But as Peter's mentioned, a number of us went to class 3 days a week for the usual obligations, and then we met for 2 hours every Thursday afternoon for Ulysses class, because the novel is that difficult to understand.
I have to say that it makes me so proud to be a part of this English department. Sometimes, you get disillusioned. Some of you who have been on faculties or are now on faculty, sometimes the business of teaching at college can wear you down. But just hearing Barry, hearing Jim, hearing these memories of Will, I'm just so proud to be a part of the English department at St. Vincent College and of Will's legacy. I certainly can't replace Will, but it's been, with Bill Snyder, I can claim to be one of the few people who were both a student of Will's and also a colleague. At least before I became full-time, I was a colleague of Will's. So I'm very proud of that. And just a few reflections on what people have said, that I am teaching business communications. And the thing I remember about business communications, Will would teach the course, and you think, well, okay, this is where we're going to learn how to write memos, and students were carrying around books like How the Capitalist System is Bringing Us Down. It's like, wait a minute, he's using the course to undermine, So I thought that was great, and I remember even when I was first starting as a sort of visiting assistant professor. There was Will in his office listening to Rage Against the Machine with some students. And he says, you really got to start listening to this stuff, Dennis. And, and I became a big fan, but he turned me on to Rage Against the Machine. He turned me on to the Fugees and several other bands. He would sit there I remember he would sit there with other students who were somewhat uncomfortable, and he would have his head in his hands listening to Janis Joplin do Ball and Chain with that monologue that she does in the Greatest Hits album. That long monologue, and he would be in sort of a reverie, or he would treat it very reverentially, and students would be wondering, like, why? Music is not for this level of contemplation. But people have mentioned how much Will made music parts of his courses and how he paid attention to contemporary music, and that's what he did. What I wanted to assure everybody here, those of you who are alums, is that Will lives in this department still. He's still very much a living presence. He's in the memories of those of us, obviously, as you know, who taught with him or who were his students. We've mentioned how his teaching style was so personable and so radical. And if we're doing things well, and when we are teaching well, we're carrying that spirit on of Will's. It's in the courses that we teach. As I've said, we're still teaching business communications, we're still teaching the moderns, we're still teaching literary criticism. I'm teaching the Beat Generation course. Will said to me when I'm teaching a course in rock and roll criticism that to a great extent was inspired by Will's example. And I was showing movies, this was a long time ago, and I teach it at night, and I'd write little movie notes. And for the movie Gimme Shelter, which is the documentary of the Rolling Stones at Altamont, And in the notes to it, I don't know, Cosmo, if you took that course with me, I said, this, Altamont was the death of the 60s. And Will was in the hall, and he took a look at my notes. He said, you know, Denny, if the 60s are dead, what's to become of us? And I thought, wow, he's so disappointed in me. I was crestfallen when I heard that, because you know, the 60s were more than just the look that he represents there. It was that style, it was that feel for language, it was that spirit of experimentation, that closeness to students, all the things that we heard from the students speak of in the passage that Woolston read. That's what it meant to him. So we try to make that live in the courses that we teach now. I want to assure everybody that. It lives in our creative writing program, which Will really started.
Words for painting feelings. So many encounters, class over dinner discussing a poem, piling into a car and driving to Pittsburgh to hear Blind write, or just pausing and chatting. After graduation, I remember driving my father's car down this long dusty road along a farm, walking into Will's home and finding him sharing a drink with the conservative economics professor. I asked them, now what do I do? I didn't think they talked. It was the left side and the right side. At least that's the way the world was at the time. They both said, become part of the system and change it from within. We were blossoming during that tumultuous period. He stimulated our awareness of our mind, our mind's eye and ear. He nurtured us. He learned to savor. We learned to savor. He was our teacher. We took it from there. I teach my students that history looks back, but art captures the moment. And I explained what the moment was when he was my teacher, what was going on in the world. And he, at the time, was more looking at nature. I remember trying to think of which artists that we appreciated, music-wise. James Taylor was someone that he liked a lot. I was into Dylan, so. Anyway, I just left class about 7 hours ago and drove here and just wanted to, I made it. This was so important to be here with you.
This is Maples, page 30. When I climbed my parents' silver maple, watched wind shining changes into grass, and came down still as a child, but rich with crookedness, looking into shadow layers, not afraid to disappear. I had no idea I was this old man, pausing to become, stripped limbs blazing across the winter dark, thinking a thought between ice and water. But I am also red maple arching into unfolded light, unshaped leaves, keeping a promise tipped and wet with mercies.
Will retired in 1996, early 1997, after a very unfortunate series of incidents. And when I was teaching freshman comp about a semester or two later, one of my students chose to write as one of her essays a memory of her experiences of Will. And this is a little long, but I'd like to share it with you because I think it's a marvelous portrait of Will. This was written on March of 1997. Before I came to college, I had an image in my mind of what a professor was. Very sharply dressed, sort of stuffy, kind of pompous and self-righteous. The first English course I took while at St. Vincent College was taught by a man who took that image and obliterated it within a few short months, leaving in my mind a more honest picture of the reality of post-secondary education. In preparation for my first semester of college, I contacted some of my upperclassmen friends and inquired about my scheduled courses and the professors who were to teach them. Most of their reports fit my expectations. The classes were a bit tougher than high school, the professors fussier and more demanding. Mr. Stubbs, however, was somewhat different. I was told that his course would be really easy because Mr. Stubbs was laid back and didn't care about anything. Someone mentioned that he had a sort of drinking problem and not to be surprised by his unprofessional behavior. These tidbits of information did little to actually prepare me for that first class with Mr. Stubbs. I recognized him as the professor only because on his feet were the combat boots that upperclassmen had told me about, and over his shoulder a satchel that had a teacherly appearance. Other than that, little about his appearance that suggested professor or even intelligence. His hair grew in marbled silver gray waves that frizzled down his shoulders and reminded me a bit of Walt Whitman. He wore sun eyeglasses, wire-rimmed with those clip-on sun lenses which he had flipped up like a visor, casting a shadow over his tired eyes. Over his full belly stretched a forest green t-shirt with a pocket over his chest from which several ink pens leaked, these stains nicely complementing various others already in place. His arms and legs had the sort of boniness typical of men in their mid-50s, with the skin starting to sag at the elbows. The gray slacks he wore were oversized and hung sloppily over the aforementioned combat boots. He positioned himself at the front of the room and rested his weight on the podium, one leg in front of the other, his arms resting on the lectern. And thus the class started. No introductions made, no syllabus passed out, no explanation of his expectations or grading system given. And at first his lectures seemed as unorganized as his attire. He would begin talking about one novel, then another, then an anecdote, then a bit about a movie he'd seen recently. My notes were a chaotic disarray of odd phrases and doodles as a result, until one day I simply put the notebook away and sat back and just listened. Some days I was a better listener than others. Sometimes I would doze off, or my mind would just pack up and leave my body to sit numbly and stare at the empty chalkboard. However, Mr. Stubbs's lectures always found their way into my brain somehow. I would leave his classes in a sleepy sort of daze, fragments of his lectures bouncing around in my thoughts. However, as I went back and reread the novels of the course, pieces fell into place in profound ways. Somehow there was a connection between the random bits of info he rattled off. Somehow there was an underlying meaning to the anecdotes and the reading of excerpts. Somehow Mr. Stubbs and his wardrobe came to represent reality and experience. As the semester dragged on, I came to a strange appreciation of Mr. Stubbs's erratic organization. Perhaps it was because he was so real, so natural, as opposed to many other professors I have encountered. He wasn't distanced from us. He didn't condescend to teach our class. He never tried to hide the fact that he was human. His mistakes were on display for all of us to learn from. He didn't put on airs. He was Will Stubbs, whatever and wherever. Part of the course included scheduling an interview with Mr. Stubbs to discuss our progress. My meeting was set for right after my art class, and as I arrived at his office carrying all my art supplies, the first thing he said to me when I entered his office was, "Nice boots," for they were like his own. He then saw my portfolio and art box and said, "Oh, you're an art student." I was so flattered by his saying this, for his voice was filled with soft admiration and respect, unlike anything I'd known. As I glanced around his office, I understood. He had a collection of posters and prints by some of my favorite artists, including some works by Monet and Van Gogh. They were displayed among the piles of cardboard boxes and shelves of books that lined the walls from ceiling to floor. Though this tiny office was no bigger than a glorified closet, It contained massive amounts of knowledge and creativity. Seated among this was Mr. Stubbs, as almost the finishing piece to the great library. We briefly discussed the classwork I had done up to that point, and I, being nervous and shy, was relieved when he dismissed me and I could head back to the dorm. However, for the duration of the semester, I wished I would have stuck around and just chatted about things. I felt there was so much I could learn from him about life, literature, and the powerful connections between the two. It wasn't as though we didn't have common ground. We liked the same authors and artists, but perhaps I was just intimidated by him. I had only had about half a semester's worth of class with him, and I felt awkward around him. I just couldn't decide how to take him. He was, after all, a professor, and I wanted to be respectful to him. Maybe it was just the way I was brought up, but I didn't feel it was my place to sit and socialize with an older person with a degree. Toward the end of the semester, Mr. Stubbs skipped class. Not that this was surprising or unusual, but with finals week upon us, I figured he would at least come and tell us what to do for our last project. When he didn't show up for the next class either, I began to get curious. Perhaps he was hung up in his office on the phone and was merely late as opposed to absent. I decided to find out if that was the case. I headed for 4th floor Placid Hall, the English department, and found his office door closed, no shining from underneath. Hesitantly, I knocked, but heard nothing from within. I turned away from the door and headed back down the stairs, but as I did, I began to feel strangely worried. Why would he skip the most crucial classes? The next morning, at breakfast, I sat with Dwayne, who was in the same class with me. "Have you heard about Mr. Stubbs?" he asked me. "Heard what?" My mind raced. Dwayne explained that Mr. Stubbs had been attacked at his home and was in very bad condition. He went on to say all kinds of things that sounded a lot like rumors to me, but they didn't matter. What mattered was that Mr. Stubbs wasn't coming back. Intentions, as good as they may be, remain just that, intentions. I had always meant to go back to the 4th floor Placid and talk to Mr. Stubbs, to extract from him some of that deep insight about how the world works from his well-read and experienced mind. After Dwayne told me about the accident, I felt very guilty for not taking the time to follow through with that intention, and I felt that my chance had been wasted and I would most likely never get it back. The incident did, however, bring into focus just how much I learned in Mr. Stubbs's class. Literature wasn't just about reading a novel, analyzing it, writing a paper about it, and taking an exam. He made us see connections between the novels and things about society that were often obscured by our prejudices. He opened our eyes to truth. About 2 hours ago, I began the walk from ground floor Alfred to the 4th floor of Placid. I had a paper to deliver for the English course I'm enrolled in for the spring semester. At the top, there were 2 metal doors which opened up to a wide hallway and an ancient archway through which I made my way to the English department. At 9:30 in the evening, the hall was much more quiet than I'd ever experienced. The office doors closed and locked like aged mausoleums. I read the names as I passed them. The first is unfamiliar. Then Dr. Tranquilla, Dr. Wasalik, Dr. Snyder, Dr. Murphy-Zahar. Then I sighed and turned to face the opposite door, the one that read Father Wolfstand. I knocked, not expecting anyone, but he was there, and I turned in my paper. I bid him farewell and closed the office door behind me, turn around, and there it was, with a pushpin holding a memo reminding me that this is Dr. McDaniel's office now. I frowned at it and slowly headed back to the archway, ignoring the icy chill that had come over me. I wondered what had happened to the Monets and Van Gogh prints. the mountains of books and papers. They gave his office away. Does that mean he's never coming back? If Mr. Stubbs never returns to teach at St. Vincent, it will indeed be a tremendous loss. When I think about my future as an English major, I wonder if I'll be able to endure the stuffy pretension of Shakespeare without Mr. Stubbs's here and now attitude. If Mr. Stubbs never teaches another class in this school, I know I can at least take satisfaction in knowing that I had a damn good class with him. Someone said to me that Dr. McDaniel is replacing Mr. Stubbs, but I doubt it. He doesn't seem like the combat boot type.